This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the privilege of having Dr. Nwando Achebe, the Jack and Margaret Sweet Endowed Professor of History, a multi-award-winning historian, and the Associate Dean for Access, Faculty Development, and Strategic Implementation in the College of Social Science at Michigan State University. She is a 2022-2023 ACE Fellow, founding editor-in-chief of Journal of West African History, co-director of Christy and Chinua Achebe Foundation, and co-CEO of Achebe Masterworks. She is also an elected member of the Nigerian Academy of Letters and vice president of the African Studies Association. Dr. Achebe received her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2000. In 1996 and 1998, she served as a Ford Foundation and Fulbright Hayes Scholar in Residence at the Institute of African Studies and History Department of the University of Nigeria. She was also a 2000 Woodrow Wilson Women's Studies Fellow. Her research interests involved the use of oral history in the study of women, gender, and sexuality in Nigeria. Dr. Achebe is the author of 6 books. Her first book, Farmers, Traders, Warriors, and Kings, Female Power and Authority in Northern Igbo Land, 1900 to 1960, was published by Heinemann. Her second book, The Female King of Colonial Nigeria, Achebe Ugbag, was winner of 3 book awards, the Ido Snyder Book Award, the Barbara Penny Kaner Book Award, and the Gita Chaudhuri Book Award. It's a full-length critical biography on the only female warrant chief and king in colonial Nigeria and arguably British Africa. The writing was funded by a generous grant from the Renner Gren Foundation. Dr. Achebe is the co-author of the History of West Africa e-coursebook through the British Arts and Humanities Research Council. She is also co-editor with William Wagner and Charles Ambler of A Companion to African History, co-editor with Claire Robinson of Holding the World Together, African Women and Changing Perspective, and sole author of the Ohio State University Press's Female Monarchs and Merchant Queens in Africa. In addition to the Renner Gren, Dr. Achebe has received a number of other prestigious grants, including awards from the Rockefeller Foundation, Woodrow Wilson, Fulbright Hayes, Ford Foundation, the World Health Organization, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She received the 2020 Inspirational Women of the Year Award, was named one of Nigeria's 100 Most Inspiring Women for 2021, received Michigan State's highest award for academic achievement, the William J. Beal Outstanding Faculty Award in 2021, and the 2023 Distinguished Africanist Award from the New York State African Studies Association. She has given over 100 invited keynote lectures and talks on 4 continents in universities in the US, the UK, Portugal, Italy, Spain, Germany, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, and China. She has also served as expert consultant for the History Channel and A&E Network Corporation's Roots, the miniseries remake, Disney Channel's African Princess Project, and has been interviewed and featured in documentaries and news programs on 3 different continents. She was featured in the History Channel documentaries Roots, History Revealed, and Roots, A New Vision, South Africa Broadcasting Corporation's news program Morning Live, Nigerian Television Authority's Weekend Deal 15-Minute Studio, and British Broadcasting Corporation's Professor Chinua Achebe, A Hero Returns, 2. Witness Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, The History Hour, and the novels that shape our world, Things Fall Apart. Dr. Achebe has been interviewed and featured in BBC Radio's Nsaka is Burning and in 2 Australian documentaries, The Invisible Hand by true crime podcast Case File Presents, and Australian Broadcasting Corporation's Radio National documentary on Benin Bronze's Stuff the British Stole. She was also a featured speaker at the 2019 Coburg History Forum debate in Berlin, A Stolen Past, Europe and the Compensation of Colonial Injustice. You can listen to her speak to New Books Network and Africa Past and Present podcast about her critical biography, The Female King. Hello, Dr. Achebe. How are you doing today?
I am doing very well. Thank you so very much for having me.
Oh, thank you so very much for being here. I know that it is a busy time and you are a very busy person. So, having this conversation is really, really so great for us. I'll get started. How did you get into Black studies and what keeps you committed to Black studies?
Hmm, Thank you. So I came into Black studies through what I would call a roundabout path, beginning in 1987. As a theater major, I was a freshman at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And while I was at UMass, I served as the president of the African Student Association, actively engaging with the issues of the day, including advocating for institutional divestment from the apartheid state, right, of South Africa. I later pursued my master's in African Area Studies and then a PhD in African history, both at UCLA. And at each of these institutions, I have the privilege of learning from remarkable African area and Black studies scholars, people such as Ekweme Michael Thelwell, Boniface Obichere, Mazizi Kunene, Edward Alpers, William Warger, Sandra Hale, Brenda Stevenson, Don Constantino, and many, many others who were shaping the field. But, on further reflection, when I truly think about my connection with Black studies, I would say that it extends even further back. You see, my family, my parents, Chinua and Christy Achebe, came to the U.S. as exiles in 1972 after fleeing Nigeria's civil war. That war led to the devastating loss of nearly 3 million Igbo people, who are my people. And my parents and my family found refuge in the Black Studies community at UMass Amherst. So the New Africa House became a home away from home for us. It was among friends like Janetta Cole, who's my Auntie Janetta, Michael Thelwell, Esther, and Eugene Terry, that my family regained a sense of self, a sense of normalcy, and a sense of belonging. These Black studies professors became our healing community. So even as a young child, I was surrounded by the love, the embrace, the ideas, the activism, the stories, and the scholarship of Black studies. And so if you were to fast forward to the early 1990s, when I went to UCLA to study documentary filmmaking, the only Africanist filmmaker was away on sabbatical. So I ended up very reluctantly taking courses in African history. And I say reluctantly because I hated history with a passion. How I am a history professor today, I just don't even know. It was one person, one man, right? But what I had imagined would be a very unpleasant detour turned out to be life-changing, right? My encounter with African history, with the incomparable Professor Boniface Obichere, African sage and historian. It was that meeting that marked the beginning of what I call my love affair with African history. So my passion for African women's history came from a desire to see myself in history. Like my father, who wrote Things Fall Apart, to push back against the dehumanizing depictions of Africans in narratives like Heart of Darkness and Mr. Johnson. Mm-hmm. I too wanted to challenge the harmful stereotypes that I was encountering. Many of the articles and books that we read portrayed African women as victims, submissive, as beasts of burden, as women who were sold to the highest bidder for their reproductive and productive labors, women without agency. But I sat in class and, I would get angry because these were not the African women that I knew. These weren't my mother. They were not my grandmother. They were not my great-grandmother. Mm-hmm. So instead of just staying angry, I decided that I would write our own stories myself, right? So I shifted fully into African history, completing my master's in African Area Studies at UCLA, and eventually my PhD in African history. My early work in film, literature, and performance gave me a unique lens as I came into Black studies through African studies. And what keeps me committed to the field of Black studies is that same drive, telling the stories that need to be told, honoring the past, and ensuring that Black voices, especially African voices, are represented with truth and dignity.
Thank you. There are so many interesting pieces of your journey into Black studies and African studies and all of the amazing work that you've done on African women and African women's history and rewriting.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
that the rewriting of it, the interjection of the stories in which you can see yourself and your mother and your grandmother is
Yes.
so important and has been really field altering in how we think about African women and their agency, as you said, like
Yes.
not
Yes.
just being objects that are enacted upon, but
Mhm.
subjects that have their own agency and have acted in ways, in varying ways, for varying
Yes.
purposes. That's so
Yes.
important.
Yes.
Building on that, being a historian who centers Black women and Black women's stories, and in particular, African women's stories,
Yeah.
how do you situate yourself in relationship to the field of history where so much of it is rooted in these archives that were not created by or for the
Yeah.
voices that you are amplifying?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say, that I'm somebody who naturally moves across the disciplines, right?
Mhm.
You talked about how do I reconcile doing the kind of work that I do with an archive that was not written for us.
Mhm.
A lot of people don't quite understand what the history of the archive is, right? As though this archive is that there is and as such a thing as an unbiased archive, right? The archive itself emerged out of a history of colonialism, right? Whether you want to talk about Africa or you want to talk about South America, for instance, these are the colonialist and the colonial enterprise that produce this archive that we have today, right? And we can't expect for the colonial voices or the colonialists that have come in to try to take land away and to try to colonize to write these glowing stories about the colonized, right? I mean, that's the first thing to sort of understand is that these government anthropologists, which is what they were,
Mhm.
they came hand in hand with the colonial enterprise to really feed and help propel the colonial, enterprise and the season away of lands. So if we start with that premise, and also knowing that the archive was very centric, right? So you have these I like to describe them as old white men
Mhm.
coming in, right, as part of the colonial enterprise and documenting things about Black, whether you want to say old Black men, because those are the people that they were talking to, right? They didn't really have conversations with African women. And in fact, African women did not trust them. So there's no way that they were having these kinds of conversations. And so in my work, I am essentially an oral historian, right? So I would say that 90% of what I do is oral history. And, I'm not doing oral history because it's the sexy thing to do. I am doing it because it oftentimes is the only way to uncover the voices of
Mhm.
these women who have remained voiceless in the traditional archive. I like to talk about the archive of the African elder. The living archive is what I call it, because these are elders that hold within themselves our stories, our histories, our realities. And, the aim is for somebody like me, trained as a historian, to dialogue with those living archives and to attempt to document that which it is that they share with me into the permanent source of the written word, right?
Mhm.
And that's essentially what it is that I've tried to do. So whether it's through oral history, whether it's through proverbs, songs, dance, cloth history, jewelry history, jewel mapping, my methodology is very interdisciplinary because it is the only way to be able to really unearth these voices, these narratives that I'm interested in documenting.
There's a lot that you just said, all of it amazing. But I'm thinking about, so with the interdisciplinary methods that you're bringing to your work, because that
Mhm.
is what's necessary in
Yeah.
order to be able to actually write and record this history
Mhm.
in to put it into a permanent archive. In what do you think are important? What shifts in methodological considerations when you are focused on oral histories?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think starting with saying that I'm somebody who is, while I am truly grounded,
Mhm.
right, in African history and its methodologies, both archival, oral, all of my work is informed by the belief that no single discipline, so it can't just be history, right? Can fully capture the complexities of African experiences. And since we're talking about Black studies, it's not just African experiences, but Black experiences in general,
Mhm.
right? And so when I think about my past and how I started off in theater, in music and dance, all of that really sort of made me the African studies scholar, the Black studies scholar, the African historian that I am, right? Because it taught me to think creatively, to think critically about storytelling. So when I think about creating histories, African histories, it's not just about African history, it's also, I draw from fields of anthropology. I mean, my method is very much drawn from feminist anthropological field methods, right? Literature, gender studies, film, music to enrich my approach. Going back to the fact that really when you think about African history in its indigenous form is performed. I think this is part of the reason why, as an undergrad, I just didn't like African history because my teachers, they weren't performers. I'm somebody who grew up, was fortunate enough to have experienced African history being performed by the griots and griots in
Mhm.
communities, right? So African history is sung, it is danced, you know, instruments are played, right? It's all of those things, that allow you to really sort of produce this thing that's called African history. So for me, the disciplines, whatever the disciplines are, they are tools, right? They're frameworks and methods, but they aren't walls. And my commitment to Black studies has a lot to do with that mindset. Black studies, African studies, I believe is inherently interdisciplinary, right? It demands that we pull from various fields in order to holistically understand African lives, holistically understand Black lives. So, in my work, whether I'm looking at African women's history or oral history or African sexualities, I am constantly weaving together different disciplinary perspectives. I also see myself as somebody who challenges disciplinary boundaries. So, for instance, I've used oral history and performance. You talked about that as legitimate sources of historical inquiry and knowledge,
Mhm.
even when those methods are seen as unconventional in traditional history departments. And I believe that that's where I'm different from the average historian, right? That's my commitment to Black studies, right? It gives me the freedom and the responsibility to ask questions such as whose knowledge is being created, whose methods are being validated, right? Black studies, African studies pushes us to rethink what scholarship should look like. And that has deeply shaped how I do work, within my discipline history and across the disciplines. So even though I am very much a historian, I don't let the discipline of history limit me. Instead, I see it as a starting point, a foundation from where I can build on bringing in insights from other fields. And so that is how I've situated myself in the study of Africa as somebody who is deeply rooted in history, but always reaching beyond it. And I think that Black studies, African studies, is that bridge that connects it all for me.
So you said, thinking about like what the questions and what does history look like? And if we're thinking about the methods and the necessity to bring in
Mm-hmm.
alternative methodologies or non-traditional methodologies based upon the disciplines as they are,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean for the products too? Right? Like I know that you've spoken in the past about the language that you use
Yeah.
and the accessibility of the histories that are being produced.
Yes.
How does your commitment to Black studies and African studies inform the end product as well as the process?
Yeah. I actually think that oftentimes the process of uncovering histories is as important as the product. Sometimes maybe even more so important, right? Where are you standing as you do African history, for instance, or African studies?
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at Africa from within, or are you looking at it from the outside? Because in the history of writing about Africa, different kinds of writing, not just historical writing, right? Our histories, our stories have been written by others in manners in which, and going back to why did I start to do this kind of work? That desire to see myself in history, to be able to relate to the stories that are being told, right?
Mm-hmm.
That are supposed to be about me, right? And so the process becomes exceedingly important. I've often said that I don't know how to do African history or African studies from a vantage point that is not indigenous. I just don't know how that even looks.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is that in order to do this work and do it well, there's certain things that have to be in place. Language.
Mm-hmm.
If you do not have African language, I'm sorry, you can't do African history or African studies the way in which I'm saying that it should be done.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody has a prerogative. You can do whatever you want to do, but are you actually doing it well? No, because African language really shapes the worldview and the thinking of Africans. So you cannot begin to understand, right, African historical processes, how Africans are thinking without a deep knowledge of culture, which is language, because language is culture and culture is language. So that's one. And it's not a situation where people can master language in a few years. It's just, you know, again, the best African studies programs, the best African history programs have students learn African language for up to 3 years. And I always trouble that and challenge that because I want to say, what is it that you can actually do with African language if you've just spent 3 years studying it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's in language that those nuances, when I talk about how I get to the end product, I talk about the ways in which I negotiate meaning with the human archives that I speak with. You can't negotiate meaning or truly understand what it is that they're saying if you don't have the language,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's so many nuances to language, which might not be obvious to somebody who doesn't have. So that's one. Secondly, for me, in terms of end product, is really defining who your audience is. I have various audiences and multiple audiences, but I've never shied away from talking about who my main audience is, right? And my main audience are always the groups of people that were so that shared their lives with me, right? And for what I do, it's these African communities. Those are my primary audiences. It doesn't mean that I don't have secondary or, yes, numerous audiences. But those are my primary, the people that shared their lives, opened up their lives and shared it with me. And I have the ethical responsibility to represent them in ways that they represent themselves. And not only represent them in ways that they represent themselves, but do it in a manner in which they can understand what it is that I'm writing.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I talk about accessibility of text and the way that I write, that's very important to me. And I don't just say it because it sounds good. I've actually put it in practice. And what I mean by that is I have presented my work to the community and had the community talk back to me. And that's the negotiation of knowledge. So first of all, you write in a manner in which they can read and understand. And you present your work, you take it to them so that they're able to critique it. And in the end, the product that comes out of that long and involved process is a much stronger history than if I had not followed that process. And it's not a process that I was taught in school. No, it's, I was quite fortunate to have encountered, and I write about this in my first book, a wonderful woman, Lady Obai, who insisted in her way that I represent her the way that she represents herself. Because she was not a literate woman. And she had, she's telling me all this stuff, which I was not buying because it wouldn't fit neatly into my thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was kind of rejecting it, but I was listening to her, right? And she was like, at the time she told me, turn off your tape recorder and tell me what it is that you heard me say. And this was 1995. Lady Obai insisted that I represent her the way that she represents herself. Because she said to me, you book people I don't read. But I want to know that in that book, that when you tell my story, that is the way that I represent myself. So yes, I truly believe that the process itself sometimes is even more important than the product, the end product. Because if the process is not the way it should be, the end product is going to be flawed.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you. That the negotiation of meaning and the capturing of the nuance in the process the necessary process that you go through to make sure that you are representing people the way that they want to be represented and giving them that space to critique it and talk back to it, I think is such an important step that too often in our disciplinary boxes, it's not considered. And it's not something that is explicitly taught when it should be the first thing.
Yeah.
Why are how are you going to write about somebody or include their stories and not have them sign off on it.
Yes. 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 And, this is oftentimes not rewarded in the academy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because this kind of work takes time. You don't just sort of get up. I mean, it's an easy thing to get up, go to the archive, document. This kind of work that I'm talking about takes years.
Mm-hmm.
My second book took 15 years to complete, right? Of which I want to say at least 3 years was in the field, right? So it's not fast work, but it's necessary work and it's important work, right? And when I said the academy oftentimes doesn't reward this, is that this is work that takes time.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, we're all on the, for those of us on the tenure track, right? There's a period of time, right, that you need to get your work done, all published with the right presses and all of that kind of stuff, right, in order to be promoted and to progress in the way that we need to in the academy. But I've been lucky in the sense that these issues that are of utmost importance to me, I've managed to sort of balance writing in an accessible way, writing to my primary communities, and still being able to produce work, scholarship that is of the quality, impeccable, right? You have to get to that right quality
Mm-hmm.
be able to, in other words, speak to multiple audiences, right? Because you have the audience of the people that entrusted you with their stories, but you also have the audience of our colleagues. And we tend to kind of want to talk amongst ourselves. And that's something that I've pushed back against because I'm not really that interested in talking back and forth amongst, I mean, I think that there's a place for that. But I think, this is where Black studies, I think, African studies is very important, that a lot of times we don't have the privilege to do that kind of very, centered type of, scholars talking, what is it called, back to themselves. The kinds of work that we're doing is so vitally important to our communities. It's uncovering voices. It's uplifting communities. It's social justice work, right? And so that makes it that much more important. Just the work of Black studies, the work of African studies, the work of women's studies.
There's so much in what you just said. I want to build on that and ask, how does your commitment and your process, how does that inform your teaching?
Yeah. So my work as a teacher and scholar is deeply, I think, rooted in Black studies and African studies, right? When I think about Black studies itself is rooted in activism. We started talking about that, right? And community. Black studies came out of a need to challenge traditional disciplines that excluded and misrepresented Black people, us, right? That history reminds me that my work isn't just about creating knowledge for the sake of it. It's about using knowledge to make an impact in society, right? And I think anybody that does Black studies understands this. So when I teach, for instance, I center voices and perspectives that have historically been marginalized, particularly those of African women, because, that's what I do. And I think that's a direct nod to the history of Black studies, right? Which has always been about giving space to those who have been overlooked. I also take a very interdisciplinary approach to my teaching, blending history with literature, film, oral traditions. So all of those sources that I talked about that inform the kind of work I do, I bring that into my classroom as well. And I think that those ideas come from Black studies as a discipline, right? As a field too.
Mhm.
Idea that you need multiple lenses to really capture the fullness of Black experience. But at the same time, my work is also, I would say, forward thinking, right? Black studies is constantly evolving. And I see my role as a professor, as a scholar, as one who works to prepare a next generation to carry things forward, whether it's about incorporating digital tools into my teaching and encouraging students to not just think in a U.S. center or centric way, right? To think more globally about the African diaspora. I'm always thinking about how the field can stay relevant and transformative. And what excites me about what it is that we do and the future of African studies, of Black studies, is Black studies' willingness, I would say, to take on new challenges. Black studies' willingness to center new voices. Black studies' willingness to embrace new methods, which really sort of goes back to, what we're talking about in terms of, what it is that I do. That's what keeps me constantly pushing the boundaries of my own work, whether I am writing, whether I'm teaching, or even mentoring students. I'm always thinking about how do we, as scholars that do this work, honor the legacy of Black studies, African studies, and how do we contribute to its continuous growth and evolution? And that's something that I very much grapple with in the classroom. So whether it's teaching undergraduate students or having the privilege to mentor PhD students, right? Those are the things that are of utmost importance.
Thank you. You mentioned Black studies and your teaching being forward thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So, building on that, what do you think, or what are some questions that you think are in the future, the near future of Black studies?
Mm. Yeah. I think, to talk about the present and future, sometimes obviously talking about the past is important, but since, the question is on the future of Black studies, I think what we're seeing, it's to me, it's a very exciting time for Black studies, right? For African studies. This whole idea of moving beyond boundaries or, whatever boundaries that we started with, right? When I think about Black studies, whereas in the past, I would say, when you talk about the history of Black studies, was very US centric in its focus, right? It came out of resistance, out of the civil rights, all of that, right? We know that, right? And I think right now, when you talk about the future, it's no longer just focused on the United States. When you think about Black studies has become increasingly more global,
Mhm.
where people that do the kind of work that I do have a space and a place in Black studies, embracing the full scope of the African world and its diaspora. Right. So, I like to talk about global Africa. It's all of that, right? And as an Africanist, somebody who's trained as an Africanist, this is particularly exciting for me because it means that Black studies as a field is grappling with the deep connections between Africa and its diasporas in ways that were perhaps not as central, before. Another thing that I see and I find exceedingly exciting and thrilling is how interdisciplinary the field is. Black studies as a field brings together history, it brings together literature, sociology, anthropology, art, music, history, you name it. It's this blending of perspectives that creates such a rich, nuanced understanding of Black life, Black culture, right? The Black world. It's also more inclusive when I think about the future, much more inclusive in terms of centering those Black voices that perhaps weren't centered in the past. What
Mhm.
do I mean by this? Much more work on Black women, right? Much more work on queer stories and voices and other perspectives that were once at the margins. And this evolution, I think, represents a broader commitment to capturing the complexity of all Black experiences. And to me, that's incredibly powerful. So when I think about the future, inspired about how Black studies continues to push boundaries. I talked about the digital space, how scholars are using technology to tell their stories in very innovative ways, how scholars are perhaps creating digital archives, interactive projects, and virtual reality experiences. I think this is the future. It's opening up entirely new ways of engaging with the Black world, with Black history, with Black culture, with Black activism. And when you speak about activism, I'm also excited about our emphasis on community and activism, right,
Mhm.
in Black studies. We've always been rooted in this idea of making a difference in the real world. And that remains true, whether it's addressing social justice issues, shaping public policy, or working with communities. The field is deeply invested in transformative work. And I think that we continue to do this. And so, in a nutshell, I would say that what excites me about the future of Black studies, of African studies, is the fact that there's a lot of potential, the fact that Black studies is not static, the fact that Black studies and African studies is always evolving, and it is a space where scholars, where activists, where communities can come together and together reimagine what is possible, right? And so for me, as both an Africanist and somebody committed to creating a much more just world, just an inclusive world, um, the endless possibilities of our future in terms of Black studies is just exceedingly exciting and inspiring. Yeah.
Thank you. That conceptualizing it that way and laying out the things that are happening is a great reminder. And it's just like it is inspiring. It's inspiring to think about where we can go,
Yes.
particularly in, moments where there is pushback and resistance.
Yes.
That's part of the history of the
Yeah.
field as well. And like that's
Yes.
going to continue to be pushed against. And
Yes.
Black studies and African studies are going to continue to exist and go further and push the boundaries
Yes.
as they always have.
Full circle moment, right?
Mhm.
You think about how we emerged as a field and as a discipline and where we are now. And
Yeah.
so importantly, what you just said, we will continue to push boundaries, right? We're not going anywhere. Not going anywhere. We will continue to tell our stories in all of our authenticity,
Mhm.
right? And there's not one, Black studies voice. There are numerous voices,
Mhm.
and being able to tell these multiplicity of voices, right? I always say to my students, I always go back to Peter Tosh that said that if you are a Black man, you're an African. And that's how I really conceptualize when I think about Black studies. I am coming to Black studies through African studies,
Mhm.
right? And with the firm belief that without Africa, there is no Black studies. Like that's the beginning, right? And for me, it's about making these connections. So even though my main field is African studies, I am always just so inspired to make connections between the African world and the African diaspora, right? That to me, that's the future of Black studies. It's not one or the other. Like when we really sort of talk about Africana, we need to think about Black studies and African studies and Africana studies much more holistically than we are.
Mm-hmm.
Right? To speak only of the African American world is to speak only of one aspect of the Black world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I'm always reminded about this Igbo proverb that says that you cannot appreciate the beauty of the masquerade dance by standing in one position. And so the challenge for us moving forward in Black studies is to make sure that we're representing not only our stories, all of our stories, and that we're privileging all of our stories. Because it is all of those stories that make who we are. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That is a wonderful note for me to stop asking questions on. But
Thank
is
you.
there anything else you would like to add, to leave the listeners with?
I can't really, let me just pause and just say thank you. Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for affirming the kind of work that I do, right? Because as you know, when we talk about Black studies, oftentimes people are not thinking about somebody like me that does the kind of work that I do. And so what you are doing with this podcast is really showing African and Black studies in its holistic, right, entirety. And I'm grateful for that opportunity. What I do is one part of this story, right, of our story, and being able to have what is it called? Being able to have platforms in which we can dialogue about just the wonderful work that we're doing in this area is so vitally important. So thank you for that opportunity.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and for all of the work that you do
Thank you.
to tell those stories and model a way of doing this work that is ethical and responsible to the community,
Yes.
and that rewrites the history, that shows Black women across the diaspora that
Yes.
there are other stories that exist outside of the colonial archives
Yes.
that we're too often given. So thank you so much for your work and for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so very much. That these are our stories. That's really why we do. That's why I do what I do, right? That every Black person can look at the histories that I produce and see themselves in it. You don't have to be from the African continent. If you are further removed, then see yourselves in all of the stories. It's yours to claim. And that's what I try to do, is for us to be able to look at those stories and say, I know that woman. She was my grandmother, right? My job has been done. But yeah, that's it, to tell our stories.
Thank you so, so much again.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to this amazing episode. It has truly been a pleasure to talk with you, Dr. Achebe.
Thank you so much.